Before preparing for this talk, I had long assumed that Munch's popularity in America began with the 1912 exhibition. But this was not actually the case. It seems that Munch's paintings were slow to gain popularity and find collectors, both private and institutional, in this country. In 1996, Michael Park Taylor wrote a superb article for the Art Gallery of Ontario's exhibition catalog featuring the Campbell collection on Munch's American reception. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Instead of repeating his thorough and very revealing article here, today I'm going to consider Munch's reception or lack of reception in America between 1912 and 1950, the date of Munch's first major retrospective in America. But I'm going to do so from a slightly different perspective. So as we know, on the left is the cover of the Scandinavian exhibition here, and on the right, an installation shot of some of Munch's paintings as they were exhibited in Buffalo. My talk today, Landscape and Narrative in Munch's American Reception, stems from early American perceptions of Munch and Norwegian art. It would be easy to assume that early on there were very few Munch landscapes in American collections, and this was indeed the case. After all, many of us, general public and scholars alike, oops, I skipped a page, associate Munch with his narrative scenes of love, anxiety, and death, not with serene Norwegian summer nights. What I discovered is that today there are still very few landscape-based paintings in American collections. Most are narrative scenes, or at least interpreted as narrative scenes. But relatedly, and just as importantly, there are far more prints in museums than paintings. Munch rarely addressed landscapes in his printed imagery. They're primarily narrative in subject. Not only is this the story of Munch in America about media, paintings versus prints, but it's also about American perceptions of Munch's nationality. It goes without saying in the Scandinavia house that Munch is Norwegian. But during the first half of the 20th century, and even still today, Americans often associate Munch with Germany. After 2 world wars with Germany as the enemy, Americans did not immediately appreciate Munch's German connections. If we begin with Munch's debut in the American popular press, we come to the brief but telling article written in Mademoiselle, New York, by Vance Thompson, which we see on the left, which reproduced the Scream lithograph. The text contains the hallmarks of the Munch myth that have been slowly debunked in recent years. As the critic noted, quote, "He was unappreciated in his country of origin, where he offends public morality," and then went on to say precisely what offended. Quote, "His pictures of violent, disheveled lovers astray in black forests, creatures primeval in the ferocity of their passion. He pictures death and the horrors of the tomb, all with immense force and urgency," unquote. And here we see the artist described as radical, offensive, violent, expressively forceful, and fascinated by death. Again, all part of the myth that came to be known to American audiences through his most famous work, The Scream, on the right. The homology between Munch's art and life, suggested in Thompson's text at the left, was repeated in Munch's own words by a quote placed next to the print in the Mademoiselle article, which is in very small letters. A slightly different translation of the supposedly autobiographical moment depicted. "I stopped and leaned against the balustrade, almost dead with fatigue. Over the blue-black fjord hung clouds of blood, as tongues of flame. My friends passed on, and alone, trembling with anguish, I listened to the great infinite cry of nature." This thing is possessed, I'm convinced. There we go. As the luminous Modernism catalog describes, Christian Brinton, who we see in the lower right part of the screen, his role in the formation of the exhibition was seminal. His descriptive passage on Munch's work in the catalog text was not dissimilar to that of Vance Thompson's 16 years earlier. Brinton stated with great flair, quote, "You will find in these beseechingly beautiful or feverishly troubled canvases now the most exalted and sensitive response to human suffering." These words, however poetic and sensational, did not quite match the works on view, with the exception of the 1896 version of The Sick Child, which we see above Brinton, and which we see as the sort of sight line in the lower register of the picture on the left. Again, The Sick Child, the work that was most in sync with Brinton's assessment, described, as he said, Munch's human suffering. This sentiment was repeated in Brinton's text to Munch's first solo print exhibition at the Commercial Bourgeois Gallery 5 years later in New York in 1919. Brinton authored the text and again focused heavily on psychobiographical readings of Munch's prints, arguing they were manifestations of his obsessions. The critics appreciated Munch's art, many of them repeating Brinton's interpretation of Munch as a tortured, misunderstood genius, but no market emerged for Munch at this time. Despite the critical success of Munch's work in 1912 and 1919, commercial success did not follow suit. So back to the 1912 exhibition. 4 of the 6 works on view depicted figures interacting with nature, or in the case of the Wuppertal Starry Night on the lower right, pure landscape. So just again, clockwise, we have the installation shot. We have In the Garden, later called Adam and Eve, Woman at a Tree, Women on the Bridge, and Starry Night, and I forgot Portrait of Hermann Schlittgen. Reviewers followed Brinton's assessment of the artist, and at subsequent venues in Buffalo and Chicago, critics focused likewise on The Sick Child and Munch's representation of suffering and death. But besides The Sick Child, the other works shown did not match the hyperbolic commentary. Nowhere do we see Munch's signature images of sexualized women, tortured men, or macabre scenes of death. The works shown exhibit high-key color and open brushwork, but the narratives are, if anything, rather sedate. At this particular moment, Munch was focusing more than ever on scenes of landscape and the history of his own country as he worked on the University of Oslo's Aula canvases, which Pat Berman has cogently addressed the impact this commission had on Munch's production at that moment. As we know, the selection for the Norwegian section of the 1912 American Scandinavian exhibition was made by the Norwegian Museum director Jens Thies, who's been mentioned already today. Thies had long been a supporter of Munch and made choices for the show that reflected Munch's current production and Munch's current interests. In his catalog essay for the 1912 show, The Art of Norway, Thies argued that Munch was, quote, unquestionably the most gifted of all Norwegian painters, the most interesting and compelling personality in Scandinavian painting of today, unquote. And indeed, it was his personality that commentators tended to focus on. But Thies went further in his essay, going against the grain of framing Munch only as a painter of tortured narratives by stating, quote, as a landscape painter, Munch is first and foremost the portrayer of the Norwegian summer night. Portrayer of the northern summer night. No one has rendered as he the mystic suggestions of those lights with mighty treetops swaying above slumbering white houses and the pale blurred outlines of the surrounding country, unquote. Here Thies was positioning the artist as a painter of landscapes and not just a chronicler of the human condition. Another important and numerically extensive exhibition for Munch on the international stage in 1912 was the Sonderbund exhibition in Cologne. As we know, between 1892 and 1908, Munch spent much of his time in Germany, taking occasional trips to Paris and spending summers in Norway. It was in Germany's capital, Berlin, that he first achieved critical notoriety and commercial success. In his adoptive country, Munch received prestigious exhibition invitations, forged contractual relationships with dealers, and fostered many generous collectors. As Tina Yarborough has shown, it was not until around 1912, and especially after the war broke out, when Munch was to a large extent cut off from Germany, that he began to establish a Norwegian market, and critical and institutional praise was solidified in his homeland. Therefore, at this time, Munch was situated in the spaces between home and abroad, seeking German approbation, but remaining geographically tied to Norway and more commercially dependent on Norway's munificence. The pinnacle of Munch's critical pre-war perception as a German was on the occasion of the Sonderbund exhibition. The organizers of the exhibition and the critical response to it effectively situated Munch as a spiritual and aesthetic founder of German Expressionism. Presented alongside Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin as the most powerful non-German influences on contemporary art, the Sonderbund spectacle transformed the perception of Munch from mentally ill and dangerous to German culture into a celebrated art world star. You see many of his paintings on display here in the Sonderbund. The curator of the Sonderbund exhibition, Richard Reiche, wrote to Munch inviting him to participate and described his overarching aim to show a developmental history of Expressionism, one that triumphantly superseded Impressionism. Separated entirely from his Norwegian contemporaries who were 6 rooms away, the Munch room was self-consciously placed directly in the midst of the Expressionists, as if proximity equated the most direct influence. So to get to the Munch section of the exhibition, you had to go through Expressionist rooms, into a Munch room, and then back through the Expressionist room. So completely separated from his other Norwegian contemporaries on view. Munch's selection itself was highly indexical, as he carefully excluded works of existential angst and personal anguish, such as The Scream or Death in the Sick Room. These pictures had become staples of his painted repertoire, signature, iconic works that were included in nearly all of his major shows since 1893. But it was not the tormented, anxious self that Munch chose to portray in the Sonderbund. Instead, he intended to image himself as the respected, controlled father figure of German contemporary art, with pictures like Girls on the Bridge, which we see at the right, which connected him to Die Brücke both visually and textually. Ferdinand Schmidt, a critic writing for the art journal Zeitschrift für Bildende Kunst, turned against 2 decades of harsh criticism directed at Munch and argued, quote, "While not all the works in the exhibition are perfect, the good ones already appear classic to us, and it's difficult for us to understand why people only a few years ago laughed at his art." Curiously, the works that brought Munch the most critical attention at the Sonderbunds were his portraits and his landscapes. The Thaw, which we see on the bottom left, was described by another critic, Arnold Fortlage, as, quote, "a landscape structured with fleeting strokes and with simple surface divisions made with clear, fresh colors." Not only the work itself, but the description of its fleeting strokes and flat surfaces, including its fresh colors, connected to the work of the Fauves and their progeny, the Expressionists. Chromatic vibrancy, near abstract mark-making, and flat surface patterning were hallmarks of Fauvist and Expressionist style. Munch no doubt chose to display this work for precisely these close visual connections they made with his European contemporaries. As well, Munch showed a large number of forest pictures, such as this from 1903 on the right. Schmidt commented favorably on these paintings as well, making the poetic assessment that, quote, "in them are his first successfully simplified landscapes. His pine forests breathe the holy stillness of undisturbed nature. They are deeper than Van Gogh in their ascension to the mystical souls of humankind." Here, Munch surpasses Van Gogh in his connection to the land, a northern land. While this landscape could have been painted in Norway, critics adopted it in the entire series of forest pictures as prototypically lush Germanic forests, those of the Grimm's brothers' fairy tales. Significantly, Munch later retitled the painting with the children on the upper left, Fairy Tale Forest. The Germanification of Munch for this exhibition was not just something noted by German critics and self-consciously promoted by Munch himself. Even his own countryman, Jens Thies, the aforementioned director of the Norwegian National Gallery, noted this tendency. As he wrote in his own review of the Sonderbund show for a Norwegian art journal, quote, "If one knows the Germans' tendency to include everything great and good into Germania's powerful maternal embrace, perhaps one is not too surprised by the large, beautiful room with Munch's paintings. It is the central point in the German section, but perhaps it was indeed with mixed feelings that Munch saw himself thusly annexed by the fatherland. He has always had a weakness to be Germanic," unquote. Munch's self-presentation in this exhibition and those of the previous 20 years actively and strategically encouraged the critical and historiographic inscription of his art as Germanic. And it was here via landscape that Munch chose to inscribe himself into the story of German Expressionism, And as we will see, this impacted his reception in America. In the wake of the 1912 American Scandinavian show, only one painting entered a U.S. museum collection. In 1929, this painting, Boy in a Rocky Landscape, on the left, was bought by the Detroit Institute of Art by the German émigré William Valentiner. During his directorship from the 1920s through the 1940s, Valentiner also built a stellar collection of German expressionist art for Detroit. But sales were slow in the US for both paintings and prints for Munch. As Munch's German dealer, J.B. Neumann, who we see on the right in a portrait by Otto Dix, J.B. Neumann noted when he arrived in New York in 1923, quote, "I was not prepared for the disappointment of discovering that interest in Munch was simply non-existent. Making inquiries of all the print dealers, I was able to find only one Munch print in New York, at the house of Mr. Keppel. Mr. Keppel was only too happy to let me have it for the original price, because he had never found anyone who wanted to look at it, let alone buy it. But after World War II, all of this would drastically change. In 1937, Munch was declared a degenerate artist by the Third Reich, and his art was purged from German museums. Like many of his contemporaries, among them the German Expressionists, their art was no longer acceptable in Germany. But by contrast, due to their purportedly anti-Nazi positioning, their art became more collectible to the Allied forces. For Munch, this of course included America. And as a quick aside, Munch was not the only Norwegian whose fate rose and fell in relation to exhibition and market trends in the early years of the 20th century. It's interesting to note that the Norwegian landscape painter Fritz Thaulow was collected widely in American museums in the 19-teens and 1920s, when Munch was being avoided. Museums from Philadelphia to Cambridge to Chicago appreciated his prototypically Norwegian imagery. In fact, there was a large exhibition of Taulow's work launched at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1903, with loans coming primarily from Chicago area collectors. But this vogue did not last long. In the 1930s, as fashion changed and French art established its hegemony, the Art Institute of Chicago deaccessioned all of their Thaulow paintings. It was not until 2004 that another work by Thaulow, the one we see below, entered the collection. This one, amazingly enough, was shown in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, only to return back to its home 100 years later. So back to Munch. In the 1940s, there was a huge surge in the acquisition of Munch prints in America. The two men principally responsible for these sales were J.B. Neumann, who we see again on the left, and Kurt Valentin on the right. These two Jewish émigré dealers left Germany and brought with them prints by Munch and the German Expressionists. And here we see some of the Munch sales they made to the Museum of Modern Art, early Munch sales. And at the same moment, the same dealers were selling or gifting German Expressionist prints by Haeckel and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. The Munch print trend continued when the Art Institute of Chicago bought some 85 Munch prints from J.B. Neumann in 1943. The Fogg Art Museum at Harvard mounted a large show of Munch's prints in 1946. And the first retrospective of Munch's work to appear in America was shown in Boston, Cambridge, and New York in 1950. In 1957, there was an important show of Munch's prints from American collections held at the Museum of Modern Art. Although many of the prints were from MoMA's collection, there were significant loans from Chicago, Providence, Cambridge, and Washington, D.C. The catalog, perhaps not surprisingly, was dedicated by the curator Bill Lieberman, quote, for J.B. Neumann, early champion of Munch, who was brought to the United States, so many of the prints discussed in these pages. Further on in the text, Lieberman described Munch's work following his return to Norway from the Danish sanatorium. Quote, during the next 30 years, he revealed the harmonies of nature rather than the conflicts of self. And in the landscapes and outdoor life of his native Norway, he perhaps found at last a refuge, unquote. Another story that remains strong in the Munch literature is that of his return to Norway in 1909, being a return to sanity, health, and the land. An increase in landscape production further fueled this perception. Now I move on. Last slide of the day. But Americans did not want the healthy, sanitized Munch of peaceful bathers, wintry landscapes, and blue summer nights, at least not yet. They wanted a disturbed Munch, one that fit the story that was easier to tell. Like the Expressionists, whose work he so inspired, promoters focus on their narrative images of urban anxiety or rural sexual liberation, a narrative not on their more serene landscapes. So, which is to say, sort of very, very similar connection to the German Expressionists, whose work was, their sort of disturbed city views were more focused on. The next 2 decades, from 1959 to 1974, did indeed see an increase in paintings and prints acquired by American museums, but no shift in purchases of pure landscapes. In fact, there are still only a handful of pure landscape paintings by Munch in America. In this last slide, I show you several works acquired by American museums during the 15-year period between 1959 and 1974. Summer Night's Dream, The Voice at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, going clockwise. Young Woman Under an Apple Tree, the Carnegie in Pittsburgh. Girls on the Bridge on the lower left at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth. And The Storm at MoMA. The women in these images have been described as experiencing various states of anxiety and distress, or alternately, as subjects in Munch's narrative from innocence to sexual abandon. But one could also argue that these 4 paintings are landscapes and not narrative works at all. Art historical scholarship has deemed them narrative scenes because that has been our obsession with Munch, trying to figure out how they embody Munch's biography. One could just as easily call these works landscapes, as more than 75% of the compositional surfaces are devoted to nature. Of course, this is pushing it a bit, but the fact, oh, that's all right, you know what I mean. But the fact remains, my last couple sentences, but the fact remains that there are compelling reasons to address Munch's nature imagery. His landscapes have been the subject of many important exhibitions in Norway and have figured into the seminal American exhibitions Northern Light, The Mystic North, Mirror of Nature, and now, of course, Luminous Modernism. Americans seem to care so very much about pretty French Impressionist landscape paintings, but they still want their Munch raw and tortured. Thank you.